The security guard looked at me like I was something he had just scraped off the bottom of his shoe. His eyes swept from my faded denim jeans to the oversized college sweatshirt that had seen better days, and I could practically hear the gears in his head calculating my net worth at roughly $12 and some pocket lint. He stepped forward, blocking my path to the Grand Meridian Hotel's main entrance, with all the self-righteous authority of someone who'd been wearing a uniform for exactly 3 days. I told him I was there for the Wong Ashford engagement party, trying to keep my voice steady despite the familiar burn of judgment crawling up my neck. The smirk that crossed his face could have curdled milk on contact. He actually laughed, a short, barking sound that echoed off the pristine marble columns, and pointed his thick finger toward the side of the building where a small, rusted sign read, quote, "0." He told me that apparently the help needed to learn how to read the appropriate signs before trying to walk through the front door. My name is Kinsley Wong, and I am 32 years old. But in that moment, standing in my deliberately casual clothes, I probably looked like I'd gotten lost on my way to deliver a pizza. The irony of the situation was so thick I could almost taste it, considering what I actually did for a living, but I kept my mouth shut because sometimes the best revenge is served in courses, like a 5-star meal. My sister Madison had called me 2 weeks ago with the enthusiasm of someone inviting a distant relative to their own execution. She had made it crystal clear over the phone that I should try to look presentable for once, because her future in-laws, the Ashfords, were very particular people. I could hear the air quotes in her voice when she said, quote, "one," which was code for judgmental snobs who measured human value by the number of zeros in a bank account. She also mentioned, oh so casually, that maybe I shouldn't mention my little online business thing because the Ashfords were old money and wouldn't understand internet jobs. The security guard was still staring at me, his radio crackling with self-importance, waiting for me to leave his precious entryway. I could have shown him my identification right then and there. I could have made one single phone call that would have changed the entire trajectory of his evening. But where was the fun in that? Instead, I smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes, and headed toward the service entrance, my beat-up sneakers squeaking against the pavement with every step. Just as I reached the heavy steel side door, a familiar voice shrieked across the parking lot, cutting through the humid evening air like a serrated knife. Madison herself, resplendent in a dress that looked like it cost more than most people's annual rent, came clicking across the asphalt in heels that definitely were not made for walking on anything but red carpets. Her face was a masterpiece of confusion and barely concealed horror as she took in my appearance. She looked right at me, then through me, and finally at the security guard who had followed me to ensure I didn't try to sneak back to the front. He began explaining that he had redirected the delivery person to the proper entrance, and I watched Madison's face go through a complex series of gymnastics. Instead of correcting him, she actually giggled, that same nervous, high-pitched laugh she had used since high school whenever she was embarrassed by association. She waved her manicured hand dismissively and told the guard that these people always get confused about where they belong. These people. Her own sister. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted the metallic tang of copper, forcing myself to walk through that service entrance with my head held high, while my heart hammered a rhythm of pure fury against my ribs. The kitchen was chaos, pure and beautiful chaos that smelled of searing Wagyu beef, truffle oil, and the sharp, acidic tang of nervous sweat. It was the heartbeat of the hotel, a place where the polite veneer of the upstairs world was stripped away to reveal the frantic machinery underneath. A sous chef immediately mistook me for the replacement server they had been expecting from the temp agency and shoved a stained white apron into my hands before I could even open my mouth to protest. The head chef, a mountain of a man named Philippe, who seemed to communicate entirely in French curse words and disappointed sighs, took one look at me and declared I was on shrimp duty. Within minutes, I was elbow deep in cold, grey crustaceans, peeling and deveining like my life depended on it. The other kitchen staff barely noticed the new addition to their ranks because they were too busy gossiping about the disaster unfolding upstairs. Apparently, Madison had already sent 3 champagne deliveries back for not being enough, whatever that meant. The servers were taking bets on how many times she would change her mind about the napkin arrangement, and the current count was 6 before the party had even officially started. I learned more about my sister in that kitchen in 20 minutes than I had in the past 5 years of sporadic, awkward family dinners. She had been terrorizing the staff for weeks with her demands, changing the menu 17 times and insisting that the flowers be flown in from Ecuador because local roses looked too. One server mentioned she had actually made the pastry chef cry over the engagement cake design because the shade of ivory was. But the real tea, as the younger servers called it, was about the Ashfords. Old money, they said, so old it had practically turned to dust. Mrs. Ashford had arrived earlier to inspect the venue and spent 40 minutes explaining how their family had been hosting parties since before the hotel was even built. She had name-dropped so many dead relatives that I thought we might need to set up a memorial table next to the buffet. The kitchen door burst open like someone had kicked it, and there stood Madison in all her bridezilla glory. Her face was the particular shade of red that meant someone, somewhere, had done something unforgivable, like breathing incorrectly in her presence. She stormed through the kitchen, her heels clicking like angry typewriter keys on the tile floor, demanding to know why the champagne was not properly chilled to exactly 37.5 degrees. Philippe tried to explain that the champagne was at the perfect serving temperature for the vintage, but Madison was not interested in facts or logic. She wanted what she wanted. And what she wanted was a level of perfection that would impress the Ashfords enough to make them forget she came from a middle-class family in the suburbs. She swept past the prep station where I was standing, wrist deep in shrimp shells, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. It was the same scent she had borrowed from my apartment 3 years ago and never returned. A small detail that stung more than it should have. She didn't even glance my way. To her, I was just another invisible pair of hands, a faceless drone making her perfect day possible. After she hurricaned her way back out, leaving a wake of terrified staff behind her, one of the servers muttered that the Ashfords were already upstairs, telling anyone who would listen that their son could have done better. The kid washing dishes laughed and said he had overheard Mrs. Ashford in the bathroom on the phone, discussing how to convince her son to call off the engagement before it was too late. I kept peeling shrimp, the cold seeped into my bones, but my mind was racing. The Ashfords were trying to sabotage my sister's engagement, and Madison was being a terror to the staff to impress them. This was turning into quite the soap opera, and I hadn't even made it to the main event yet. I finished my shrimp duty, wiped my hands on a towel, and told Philippe I needed a bathroom break. I slipped out of the kitchen with my apron still tied around my waist, moving through the back corridors with the ease of someone who knew the blueprints better than the architect. The service elevator was empty, which was perfect because I needed a moment to decompress before I did something I might regret, like strangle my sister with a string of pearls. I pressed the button for the penthouse floor, not the party floor, but the one above it. The executive level. My level. 3 years ago, I bought the Grand Meridian hotel chain. Not just this hotel, but all 17 properties across the country. The deal had been conducted through my holding company, KU Enterprises, and I deliberately kept my personal name off most of the public-facing paperwork. It was cleaner that way, and it meant I could walk through my properties without being treated like the owner, allowing me to see the cracks in the foundation that a CEO usually misses. You learn a lot about your business when people don't know you sign their paychecks. The elevator opened to my private office suite, and I used my thumbprint to unlock the heavy oak door. The space was everything the party downstairs wasn't: quiet, minimalist, and sane. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, the lights twinkling like diamonds against the velvet black sky. My assistant had left the weekly reports on my desk, stacked neatly in colour-coded folders. But I wasn't interested in occupancy rates or revenue per available room right now. I was interested in the security monitors that lined the far wall, showing every public area of the hotel in high-definition clarity. I flipped through the camera feeds until I found the ballroom. There they were, the Ashfords in all their glory. Mrs. Ashford looked like she had been vacuum sealed into her silver dress, and her face had that peculiar, shiny tightness that suggested her plastic surgeon had been a bit too enthusiastic with the Botox needle. She was holding court near the bar, surrounded by a group of women who all looked like they had been ordered from the same, quote, 5 catalogue. The story of how I had built this empire while my family thought I was struggling with a little online business was almost funny in hindsight. Madison had been so proud of her marketing job at a mid-tier company, always quick to offer me career advice and clip job listings she found in the paper that might be, quote, 6 for someone with my limited experience. Meanwhile, I had been quietly building a hospitality empire, starting with one struggling hotel I had bought with every penny of my savings and a high-interest loan that had kept me up at night for months, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had made a mistake. The renovation had been brutal, physically and mentally, but I had done a lot of the work myself, learning the business from the ground up, scrubbing toilets and balancing books until my eyes blurred. That first hotel had led to another, then another, until I had a portfolio that would make those old money Ashfords weep into their trust funds. I zoomed in on one of the security cameras just in time to catch something interesting happening in the corner of the ballroom. Mrs. Ashford was having an intense conversation with someone from the catering staff, a man I didn't recognise from the kitchen crew. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting around the room. She was pressing something into his hand that looked suspiciously like a roll of cash. The man nodded, shoved the money into his pocket, and scurried away toward the kitchen service doors. Curious, I pulled up the footage from 5 minutes earlier and watched their entire interaction in fast forward, then slowed it down to analyse the details. The audio was muffled because of the ambient noise of the jazz band warming up, but the body language was screaming loud and clear. Mrs. Ashford was giving instructions, pointing at various areas of the ballroom, the sound system, the cake table, the projector screen, and the man was nodding along like an eager puppy. This wasn't about champagne temperature or napkin arrangements. This was something far more malicious. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I made a quick call to my head of security, asking him to keep a close eye on the situation, but not to intervene just yet. I needed to see how this played out. Then, I turned back to the monitor and saw Madison. She was frantically adjusting her dress every time Mrs. Ashford looked her way, laughing too loudly at every terrible joke Mr. Ashford made about his golf game. It was painful to watch, like seeing someone trying to squeeze into shoes that were 3 sizes too small, desperate to fit in where they clearly weren't wanted. I sighed, turned off the monitor, and changed back into my server's apron. If Mrs. Ashford wanted to play games at my hotel, in my house, well, she was about to learn that the house always wins. I grabbed my phone, checked the time, and headed back to the service elevator. The game was on. The transformation from the sterile, utilitarian service corridors to the main party space was like stepping through a shimmering portal from Kansas directly into a very confused version of Oz. If Oz had been decorated by someone with an unlimited credit limit and absolutely no taste, it would have looked exactly like the ballroom Madison had designed. She had gone for an aesthetic I could only describe as Kardashian meets Downton Abbey, a clash of eras and styles that made my eyes ache. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars competed for attention with aggressive purple LED uplighting that washed everyone out and made their teeth look radioactive. There were enough flowers crammed into the space to stock a national botanical garden, and the scent was so overpowering it was almost choking, a thick wall of lilies and roses that masked the smell of the food. The Ashfords stood near the centre of this floral explosion, looking like they would rather be undergoing a root canal without anaesthesia. Their son Brett, because of course his name was Brett, stood beside them with the miserable expression of a man being slowly strangled by his own silk bow tie. He looked like he was dissociating, his eyes glazed over as he stared at a spot on the wall just above my head. I circulated through the crowd with my silver tray, becoming invisible in that peculiar, dehumanizing way service staff become at high-end functions. Rich people, or people pretending to be rich, have this amazing evolutionary ability to take things from your tray while looking right through your body, as if the champagne just materialized in their hands through sheer force of will. Mrs. Ashford was holding forth to a captive audience about their family estate in Connecticut, explaining to anyone within earshot how they had been forced to let go of some of their domestic staff because good help was simply impossible to find these days. The irony of her saying this while snatching a glass of vintage champagne from my tray without even a flicker of acknowledgement was not lost on me. Her husband stood beside her, nodding along like a bobblehead doll, though his eyes kept drifting desperately toward the nearest exit sign. I lingered near their circle, refilling empty glasses and adjusting napkins, waiting for a nugget of information. Then I heard something that made me freeze in my tracks, my hand gripping the cold metal of the tray until my knuckles turned white. Mrs. Ashford was leaning in to tell Madison about how they would need to sit down soon to discuss the financial arrangements for the wedding, specifically how Madison's family would be contributing to their son's investment portfolio. She made the request sound casual, like she was asking for a cup of sugar, but I had negotiated enough high-stakes business deals in my life to recognize a shakedown when I heard one. Madison was nodding eagerly, her face flushed with the desperate need to please, promising that her family had significant resources and that her sister was a very successful investor who would definitely want to contribute to the union. I nearly dropped my tray of crystal flutes right there on the parquet floor. Madison was using me, the sister she had shamed and directed to the service entrance, as her imaginary financial backing to impress these vultures. She was selling a version of me that she didn't even know existed, all while treating the real me like garbage. I moved away before I could say something that would blow my cover, my mind reeling from the audacity of it all. As I refilled my tray at the service station, trying to compose myself, Brett's brother, Chase, sidled up to me. He was the type of guy who thought his trust fund made him irresistible, sporting slicked-back hair that looked wet, and a smile that had probably worked on 19-year-old Instagram models in darkened nightclubs. He leaned in close, invading my personal space with a cloud of expensive, musky cologne and entitlement. Chase looked me up and down with a predatory gaze that made my skin crawl, asking if I was working this party all night or if I got breaks. I kept my eyes on my tray and told him politely that I would be working until the job was done. He actually winked at me, a slow, deliberate wink like we were in some bad romantic comedy where the rich boy falls for the plucky servant girl. He slipped what he probably thought was a subtle $100 bill onto my tray, right next to the empty glasses, and told me to find him later if I wanted to make some real money. The bile rose in my throat, hot and acidic, but I forced a tight smile and moved away, adding his disgusting proposition to my mental list of things that would make the eventual takedown of this family even more satisfying. As I continued to circulate, weaving through the clusters of guests, I heard more and more pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The Ashfords were name-dropping connections they claimed to have, investment opportunities they were pursuing, and properties they supposedly owned. But something felt off about the cadence of their bragging, like they were trying too hard to establish their credentials, repeating the same stories with slightly different details each time. During a quiet moment when the speeches began and the lights dimmed, I slipped into the business centre just off the main ballroom. It was a small, quiet room lined with mahogany and computers, a sanctuary from the noise next door. I pulled out my phone and started digging. A few quick searches on the private databases I had access to, followed by some text messages to my network, revealed exactly what I had suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe. The Ashfords were broke. They weren't just a little cash poor or having a bad quarter. They were drowning in debt, selling the family silver broke. Their precious estate in Connecticut had 3 mortgages on it, the most recent one taken out at a predatory interest rate. Their investment portfolio had been liquidated 2 years ago, and they had liens against them from multiple creditors, including a lawsuit from a former event planner they had stiffed. Suddenly, Everything made perfect, terrible sense. They weren't trying to stop the wedding because Madison wasn't good enough for them. They were desperate for it to happen because they thought Madison's family had money. The financial arrangements Mrs. Ashford had mentioned weren't contributions to a joint future. They were a desperate hope for a bailout. The cosmic joke of the situation almost made me laugh out loud in the silence of the business centre. Here were the Ashfords, looking down their surgically enhanced noses at everyone in the room, treating the staff like furniture, all while secretly hoping my sister's imaginary wealthy family would save them from bankruptcy and public humiliation. And here was Madison, pretending to be something she wasn't, spending money she didn't have to impress people who were pretending even harder. It was a circle of deceit so perfect it was almost poetic. I went back to serving champagne, but now I was really paying attention, watching them with the eyes of a predator rather than prey. Mrs. Ashford was getting bolder with the open bar, her voice rising as she mentioned to her circle of friends how Madison's family would be investing in some of Brett's new ventures. Madison stood nearby, smiling and nodding like a bobblehead, completely unaware that she was being set up as the golden goose in a con game that was about to collapse. The party was in full swing now, the noise level rising with each round of drinks, and the air was thick with the smell of desperation and expensive perfume. I spotted the man Mrs. Ashford had bribed earlier doing something suspicious near the main sound system booth. He was pretending to adjust a cable, but I watched him palm what looked like a USB drive and plug it into the console when the audio technician turned his back. Whatever sabotage she had planned was about to go down, and I needed to decide whether to let it play out or intervene. That was when I spotted my general manager, David, standing at the ballroom entrance. He had a look on his face that I knew well, the "we have a serious problem" look. He was holding a black folder in his hand and scanning the crowd with anxious eyes, looking for the person in charge. I had a pretty good idea what was in that folder. The Ashfords' check for the party deposit had likely just bounced, or the final payment hadn't cleared. David was here to handle it discreetly, as he always did, but he didn't know the players in this particular drama. The evening was about to get very interesting, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect if I had scripted it myself. I slipped back into the shadows of the business centre one last time and made a series of phone calls that would have made Madison's head spin if she knew about them. First, I called my chief financial officer, who confirmed what I had suspected about the Ashfords' financial situation with a few keystrokes. They were about 6 weeks away from losing their Connecticut estate to foreclosure, and their credit rating was in the single digits. Second, I called my legal team and had them start preparing documents that might come in handy later, specifically regarding fraud and theft of services. Third, and most importantly, I texted David, my general manager, who was still hovering at the ballroom entrance like a worried father at a teenage house party. I told him to give me 20 minutes before approaching anyone about the payment issue. He texted back a simple, "Understood," though I could practically hear the confusion in his voice. He knew something was up. He had never received a direct order from me to delay a payment confrontation, but he trusted me enough not to ask questions. That was why he was worth every penny of his 6-figure salary, which, incidentally, was probably more liquid cash than the Ashfords had in all their accounts combined. Back in the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Madison had commandeered the microphone and was thanking everyone for coming to celebrate their love, her voice trembling slightly with emotion and champagne. She actually used the phrase, "joining of two great families," and I watched Mrs. Ashford's face contort into what might have been a smile if her facial muscles were still capable of movement. The Botox made it look more like she was trying to solve a complicated math problem while smelling something bad. Madison went on about how grateful she was to have found Brett and how their families were so perfectly matched in values and status. And then she delivered the kicker that made my jaw drop. She announced to the entire room that her extremely successful investor sister was secretly there tonight, observing everything from the wings, and would be making a significant announcement about a wedding gift later in the evening. I nearly choked on my own spit. Madison was using me as a prop in her fantasy, a silent partner to validate her lies, not knowing I was standing 10 feet away, holding a tray of crab cakes that no one was eating because Mrs. Ashford had loudly declared them, quote, 11, quote, earlier. The USB drive guy from earlier was definitely up to something. He had finished his work at the soundboard and was giving Mrs. Ashford a subtle nod from across the room. In about 5 minutes, whatever audio file Mrs. Ashford had given him would start playing. Based on the malicious smirk that was spreading across her face, it wasn't going to be wedding bells or a sentimental slideshow. I texted my head of security to download everything from the USB drive remotely before it could play, and then to back up all our security footage from the last 2 hours to a secure server. If Mrs. Ashford wanted to play dirty, she was about to learn that she had picked the wrong hotel to do it in. Chase Ashford cornered me again near the service station, this time with his hand actually resting on my lower back, his fingers pressing into the fabric of my cheap shirt. He started telling me about his cryptocurrency ventures and how he could change my life if I was nice to him. The fact that the crypto market had crashed 3 months ago and his ventures were probably worth less than the lint in my pocket made his proposition even more pathetic. I told him I needed to refill my tray and escaped before I did something that would definitely blow my cover, like explain to him exactly how many times over I could buy and sell his entire family tree. Philippe emerged from the kitchen looking like he had just survived a war zone. Madison had apparently sent him a series of contradictory messages about the dinner service in the last 10 minutes. First, she wanted to move it up by 30 minutes, then back by 45, then to the original time, but with a completely different menu sequence. The kitchen staff was ready to mutiny, and I didn't blame them. I made an executive decision right there in the hallway. I told Philippe to serve dinner at the original time with the original menu and to ignore any further text from the bride. He looked at me skeptically. After all, I was just the shrimp girl who had wandered in from the street. But something in my tone, perhaps the steel that comes from running a multi-million-dollar corporation, must have convinced him because he nodded and retreated to his kitchen kingdom without an argument. The security footage I had requested was now accessible on my phone, and it was even better than I had hoped. Not only had Mrs. Ashford bribed someone to sabotage the party, but she had also been caught on camera going through Madison's purse when my sister had left it at her table to dance. She had photographed something inside the purse, probably Madison's identification or credit cards, the kind of information you would need for a background check or a credit report. She was digging for dirt, or perhaps trying to steal an identity to open more lines of credit. David finally entered the ballroom properly, folder in hand, and began making his way through the crowd with purpose. The band was playing some generic jazz that all sounded the same, the musical equivalent of elevator wallpaper, providing a surreal soundtrack to the approaching storm. I watched David approach the head table where both families were seated. The Ashfords looked regal in their borrowed finery, sipping drinks they couldn't pay for, while Madison's parents looked like they would rather be at home watching game shows. David leaned in to speak quietly to the group, probably asking for quote 13 to discuss an urgent matter. I saw Madison's face light up with a mixture of excitement and relief. She assumed he meant her, of course. She stood up, smoothing her dress, ready to handle whatever minor catastrophe had arisen so she could look like the capable hostess. But David walked right past her. He kept walking, scanning the room with that serious, professional gaze, and I knew the moment had finally come. I set down my serving tray on the nearest empty table, the crystal glasses clinking softly against the polished wood, and started walking toward David. The distance between us was only about 30 feet, but it felt like crossing a canyon that separated two completely different lives. Madison was still standing by the head table, her hand extended as if to catch David's sleeve, saying something about how he must be confused and that she was the Miss Wong he was looking for. She looked desperate, her eyes darting between David's retreating back and the confused faces of her in-laws, trying to maintain control of a narrative that was rapidly disintegrating. David didn't even break his stride. He walked right past her outstretched hand, his focus locked entirely on me. The look on Madison's face when she realized he was ignoring her to approach the sister she had banished to the service entrance was a mixture of bewilderment and rising panic. It was the look of a director, watching an extra walk onto the stage and start rewriting the script in real time. She took a step forward, her heels wobbling slightly on the plush carpet, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish that had just discovered air wasn't water. David stopped directly in front of me, ignoring the stain on my sweatshirt and the messy bun that was starting to come undone. He adjusted his tie, gave a slight, respectful bow of his head, the kind he usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, and handed me the black folder with a professional nod. The music had died down as the band realized something unscripted was happening, and in the sudden vacuum of sound, David's voice carried with perfect clarity to the nearby tables. He informed me that we had a situation with the Ashford party payment, stating clearly that the cheque had been returned for insufficient funds and that the bank had flagged the account for potential fraud. The silence that followed was so complete and so heavy that you could have heard a pin drop from outer space. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of suffocating silence that sucks the air out of a room. Madison's face went from confused to mortified to furious in about 3 seconds flat. The transition was terrifying to witness. Her complexion turned a blotchy crimson, clashing violently with her expensive dress, and the veins in her neck stood out like cords. She started shrieking, her voice cracking under the strain, screaming that I was ruining her party with my pathetic attempts at humour. She turned to the security guards stationed at the perimeter, pointing a shaking finger at me, and demanded that they remove me immediately because I was clearly delusional and trying to embarrass her on her special day. The guests were whispering now, a low hum of scandalized gossip that buzzed like a hive of angry bees. Mrs. Ashford looked like she had swallowed a lemon whole, her eyes narrowing as she tried to assess whether this was a joke or a threat. That was when I did something I had been wanting to do all evening, something I had fantasized about every time my sister had made me feel small or insignificant over the last decade. I reached behind my back and untied the knot of my stained white apron. I pulled it off slowly, deliberately, folding it into a neat square with calm precision while everyone watched. I handed the folded apron to a passing server who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor, and then I turned to face the room. I straightened my spine, rolled my shoulders back, and let the persona of the helpful, invisible sister drop away like a heavy coat. I projected my voice to the back of the room, using the tone I reserve for boardroom negotiations and firing incompetent executives. I told them that I thought there had been some confusion regarding the hierarchy of the evening. I introduced myself as Kinsley Wong, and then I dropped the hammer. I stated clearly that I owned this hotel. In fact, I clarified that I owned all 17 Grand Meridian hotels across the country, along with the holding company that managed the land this building stood on. The gasps were audible, a collective intake of breath that sounded like the room was suddenly running out of oxygen. Mrs. Ashford's face tried to express shock, but the Botox held firm, resulting in a bizarre, frozen mask of terror. Madison looked like someone had just told her that Santa Claus was real, but that he had been avoiding her house on purpose for 30 years because he didn't like her personality. She stared at me, her eyes wide and wet, shaking her head in a slow, rhythmic denial. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen, activating the override feature I had installed in the audio-visual systems of all my properties for emergencies just like this. The massive projection screens that had been showing a looped slideshow of romantic, airbrushed photos of Madison and Brett suddenly flickered and went black. A moment later, they roared back to life with a high-definition feed from the security cameras. The first clip showed Mrs. Ashford, clear as day in her distinct silver dress, huddled in the corner of the ballroom 40 minutes ago. The resolution was crisp enough to see the beads of sweat on her upper lip. The room watched in stunned silence as she handed the roll of cash to the staff member, her lips moving in clear instructions. Then the angle changed, showing her sneaking over to Madison's table while my sister was on the dance floor. The camera zoomed in as Mrs. Ashford rifled through Madison's purse, pulling out her wallet and photographing her driver's license and credit cards with her phone. The collective gasp from the audience this time was louder, tinged with genuine horror. Madison turned to look at the screen, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes darting from the video evidence to her future mother-in-law, who was now gripping the tablecloth so hard her knuckles were white. Then I played the audio file. This was the masterstroke. I explained to the room that Mrs. Ashford had bribed a staff member to plant a recording in the sound system, intended to play during the cake cutting. I tapped my phone again, and the audio file began to play over the ballroom's concert-quality speakers. It was a recording of Madison's voice, but it sounded disjointed, choppy. It was a montage of sentences edited together from what must have been hours of recorded phone conversations. In the doctored clip, Madison's voice was saying that she couldn't stand the Ashfords, that they were boring old fossils, and that she was only marrying Brett for his money so she could drain their accounts and leave him. The editing was clumsy, but the intent was vicious. The room erupted into chaos. Mrs. Ashford was trying to stand up, sputtering excuses, waving her hands as if she could physically wave away the giant images of her own treachery looming over her. Mr. Ashford looked like he wanted to dissolve into his chair and become part of the upholstery. Brett stood frozen, looking between his mother and Madison like he was watching a tennis match in hell, his mouth hanging open in a perfect circle of shock. Chase, the cryptocurrency Casanova who had tried to buy my dignity for $100, tried to slink away toward the side exit, keeping his head down. But I wasn't letting him off that easy. I called out his name, my voice cutting through the din like a whip crack. I asked him sweetly if he still wanted to discuss that business proposition he had mentioned earlier, the one where he offered to change my life if I was nice to him. I held up my phone and told the room that I had that interaction on a recording too, if anyone was interested in hearing how the Ashford heir treats the service staff. His face went from red to white to a sickly shade of green, a Christmas colour palette of pure humiliation. He froze, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck, and slowly sank back against the wall. Madison finally found her voice, and it was not a happy one. She turned on me, her shock morphing back into defensive anger. She accused me of sabotaging her engagement, of being jealous, of deliberately humiliating her in front of everyone she was trying to impress. She actually used the phrase that I had always been jealous of her sparkle, which would have been laugh-out-loud funny if the situation wasn't so tragic. I let her rant for a full minute, standing perfectly still, letting her pour all her insecurity and venom out onto the floor. It was actually impressive how many accusations she could fit into such a short time, listing every perceived slight from our childhood to the present day. When she finally paused to take a breath, I simply held up the black folder David had given me. I spoke calmly, my voice steady and cold. I told her that the Ashfords' check had bounced. I explained that they didn't have the money to pay for this party, or for the flowers, or for the champagne she had been complaining about all night. I told her that according to the public records I had just pulled, they didn't have money for much of anything. I listed the facts like I was reading a grocery list. 3 mortgages on the family estate, Brett's trust fund emptied 2 years ago, and about 15 maxed out credit cards between them. Mrs. Ashford tried to protest, screeching that this was a lie, that I was slandering them, but I tapped my phone again. The screens changed, replacing the security footage with the property records and court documents I had accessed. There it was, in black and white, projected 20 feet high for everyone to see. Foreclosure notices, lien filings, and a credit report that looked like a horror story. I pointed to the screen and told Madison that they were planning to use her for money. Money they thought her family had. Money they thought I had because she had lied to them about our family's wealth. I told her that she was half right. I did have money, more than the Ashfords had ever seen, but they weren't getting a single penny of it. I turned to Madison, who had gone from angry to devastated in the blink of an eye. The fight had drained out of her, leaving her looking small and fragile in her expensive dress. I told her that they had been playing her from the start. I revealed that Mrs. Ashford had hired a private investigator to look into our family's finances 3 months ago. I swiped on my phone and an invoice appeared on the screen. a bill from a shady PI firm, charged to a credit card that was currently over its limit. The room was in absolute chaos now. Guests were whispering frantically. Some were openly recording the meltdown on their phones, and the Ashfords looked like they were melting under the heat of the spotlight. But the best part, the absolute peak of the evening, was yet to come. I stepped closer to the head table, entering the personal space of the Ashford family. I announced that we needed to discuss the bill for tonight's party. I stated the total amount, $47,000, not including the gratuity for the staff they had mistreated all night. I told them that since the Ashfords clearly couldn't pay, and since this was technically their son's engagement party, I had two options. Option 1. I call the police right now and report a theft of services, which would involve everyone being escorted out in handcuffs in front of their society friends. Or option 2, the Ashfords could leave now, quietly, and I would absorb the cost as a wedding gift to my sister, assuming there was still going to be a wedding after this disaster. The silence stretched out, taut as a violin string about to snap. Everyone looked at Brett. He was the pivot point, the only one who hadn't been actively malicious, just spineless. He looked at his parents, then at the screens showing their financial ruin, and then at Madison, who was weeping silently. Brett finally spoke up, and he surprised everyone, including me. He turned to Madison with tears in his eyes, ignoring his mother's hissed commands to be quiet. He said he had no idea about his parents' schemes to sabotage her. He admitted he knew they were broke, but he thought they were handling it with dignity, not by trying to con his fiancée's family into a bailout. He looked broken, a man realizing his entire world was built on a foundation of lies. Madison was crying harder now, her carefully applied makeup running in designer streams down her face. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time all evening, and whispered a question that cut through the noise. She asked if I really owned this place, if I owned all of them. I nodded. I told her that my online thing was the platform I built to manage hotel bookings, which became so successful that I used the profits to buy my first hotel, then another, then the entire chain. I reminded her that I had tried to tell her multiple times over the years, but she always changed the subject when I talked about work because she didn't think it was important. The Ashfords were trying to gather their dignity and leave, Mrs. Ashford clutching her purse like a shield. But I had one more card to play, one final nail in the coffin of their reputation. I called out to Mrs. Ashford as she turned to flee. I told her that the gentleman she had bribed to sabotage the party, the one she thought was just a greedy sound technician, was actually one of my head security officers. I told her we had her entire conversation on tape, not just the visual, including the part where she discussed ruining the party specifically to make Madison look bad, so Brett would be humiliated enough to call off the engagement. I asked her if she would like me to play that specific audio clip for everyone before she left, just to clear up any lingering doubts about her character. She shook her head violently, her face a mask of pure panic. She grabbed her husband's arm, digging her nails into his suit jacket, and practically ran for the exit, her heels clacking frantically on the hardwood floor. Chase tried to follow them, muttering something about how this was all a misunderstanding, but the crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, not out of respect, but to avoid the contagion of their failure. The security guard from the beginning of the evening, the one who had laughed at my clothes, was standing by the double doors. As I watched the Ashfords flee, I locked eyes with him across the room. The look of absolute horror on his face when he realized that the woman he had sent to the service entrance was the woman who signed his paychecks was a portrait of pure regret. The exodus was swift and brutal, a mass migration of social climbers desperately distancing themselves from the radioactive blast radius of the Ashford reputation. Nothing kills a high society party faster than the revelation that the hosts are destitute frauds and the bride's sister holds the deed to the building. I watched from the centre of the room as the guests scurried toward the exits, clutching their designer handbags and whispering furiously into their phones, likely spreading the news before they even reached the valet stand. Within minutes, the cavernous ballroom was eerily empty, save for the scattered debris of the evening, half-eaten appetizers, abandoned champagne flutes, and the heavy, suffocating silence of ruined expectations. My parents, who had remained stoically silent through the entire ordeal, sat at their tables staring at me as if I had just sprouted wings and announced I was an alien from Mars. They looked stunned, processing the fact that their daughter was actually the titan of industry they had been reading about in business magazines, without realizing it was me. Madison and Brett remained at the head table, surrounded by expensive floral centerpieces that were slowly wilting under the harsh lights, looking like two survivors of a shipwreck washing up on a desolate shore. Madison finally stood up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and began the long, humiliating walk across the dance floor toward me. Her shoulders were shaking violently, and the sound of her heels on the parquet floor echoed with a lonely, hollow rhythm. I braced myself for another tirade, expecting her to scream that I had destroyed her life, that I was a monster for exposing her lies so publicly. I stiffened my spine, ready to defend my actions, but as she got closer, I saw that the rage was gone, replaced by a devastating, raw vulnerability. She didn't scream. Instead, she collapsed against me, throwing her arms around my neck and sobbing into my shoulder with the force of a breaking dam. Her tears soaked through the fabric of my old college sweatshirt, ruining it with streaks of mascara and foundation. But for once, I didn't care about the mess. She kept repeating that she was sorry, her voice muffled and broken, saying over and over that she didn't recognize me, that she hadn't wanted to see me because I reminded her of everything she was trying to hide. She confessed between sobs that she had been so obsessed with becoming someone else, someone worthy of the Ashfords' approval, that she had completely lost sight of who she really was and who I was. I stood there for a moment, my arms hovering uncertainly before I finally wrapped them around her shaking frame. Despite the cruelty she had shown me, despite the weeks of humiliation and the years of dismissal, she was still my little sister. I held her while she cried, feeling the sharp angles of her shoulder blades, and realized that her monstrous behavior had been a suit of armor worn by a deeply insecure woman terrified of being exposed as a fraud. I whispered to her that the really sad part of all this wasn't the ruined party or the public embarrassment. I told her that if she had just asked me for help, if she had just come to me honestly, instead of trying to hide me away like a dirty secret, I would have given her everything. I would have paid for the wedding. I would have helped with the house. I would have done anything for her, no questions asked, because that is what family does. Madison pulled back to look at me, her face a ruin of smeared makeup and blotchy skin, and the realization of what she had thrown away washed over her fresh, triggering a fresh wave of tears. She had been so busy chasing the approval of strangers that she had alienated the one person who would have loved her without condition or cost. Brett approached us then, moving with the hesitation of a stray dog that expects to be kicked. He looked terrified, glancing at the security guards as if he thought I might have him forcibly thrown out onto the street along with his parents. But as he came closer, I saw something in his eyes that surprised me. Relief. There was no anger, no entitlement, just a profound, exhausting sense of shame and a strange kind of liberation. He apologized profusely, his voice cracking, telling me that he had absolutely no idea about the extent of his parents' schemes or the depths of their financial ruin. He admitted that he knew things were tight, but he had believed their lies about liquidity issues and temporary setbacks. He told Madison right there, in front of me and our parents, that he understood if she wanted to call off the engagement immediately. He said he wouldn't blame her for walking away from a man whose family had tried to use her as a financial life raft. He offered to work to pay back every cent of the party costs, even if it took him 10 years, insisting that he wanted to take responsibility for the mess his name had created. Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the black makeup further across her cheek, and looked at him. She looked at me, standing there in my stained clothes but holding all the power, and then back at the man who had just lost everything. She told him bluntly that his parents were terrible people, spectacularly terrible, and that she never wanted to see them again. But then she softened, her voice gaining a quiet strength I hadn't heard in years. She told him that he had stood up to them in the end, that he hadn't run away like a coward when the truth came out, and that he was nothing like them. She said that if he still wanted to marry her, knowing full well that she wasn't rich, that she had been pretending to be someone she wasn't, and that she had been horrible to her amazing sister, then the answer was yes. It wasn't the most romantic proposal acceptance I had ever witnessed. There were no doves or violins, just the smell of stale food and the hum of the air conditioning. But it was honest. For the first time all evening, perhaps for the first time in their relationship, they were seeing each other without the filters of money and expectation. I decided to intervene before the moment became too sentimental, stepping into my role not just as a sister, but as a CEO who solves problems. I told Madison that the apology was a good start, but words were cheap, and she had a debt to pay that went beyond money. I offered her a job starting the very next day. I made it clear that this wasn't a handout or a cushy executive position where she could sit in an office and pretend to work. I told her she would be starting at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy in the hotel industry. I explained that she was going to work in every single department she had terrorized, starting with housekeeping, then moving to the kitchen, and finally the front desk. She was going to scrub toilets, peel shrimp until her fingers bled, and deal with unreasonable guests who acted exactly like she had. She was going to learn this business from the ground up. And more importantly, she was going to apologize personally to every single staff member she had mistreated over the last few weeks. Madison nodded eagerly, without a shred of hesitation, looking almost grateful for the chance to do something real. She said she wanted to do it, that she needed to understand what it felt like to be on the other side of the service door. Brett looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear, asking if there was any place for him in this new world order. He said he wanted to work too, that he was sick of being the idle son of a fading dynasty and wanted to earn his own money for the first time in his life. He confessed that he had a degree in finance that his parents had never let him use because they thought actual employment was beneath an Ashford. I looked him over, assessing his sincerity. I told him that I would find him a position in our corporate accounting department, specifically in the auditing division, where we tracked every penny. I figured someone who had grown up watching his parents juggle debt and hide assets would have a natural nose for financial discrepancies. He wouldn't be starting as a manager, but as a junior analyst, proving his worth with spreadsheets and long hours. He accepted the offer with a handshake that was firm and grateful, the first honest transaction he had probably made in years. The three of us stood there in the wreckage of the party, forging a new contract based on labour and truth rather than inheritance and lies. As we finally turned to leave the ballroom, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and the security guard from the beginning of the evening stepped into our path. It was the same man who had laughed at my clothes and directed me to the service entrance, the man who had treated me like a vagrant because I didn't fit his narrow definition of worth. He looked like he was about to be sick. His face was pale and sweaty, and he was wringing his cap in his hands like a disobedient schoolboy. He started apologizing before I even reached him, rambling about how he was just following protocol, how he didn't know, how he had made a terrible mistake. He apologized about 17 times in 30 seconds, which might have been a new world record for backpedaling. I stopped in front of him, letting the silence stretch out for an uncomfortable moment. I told him calmly that he was indeed just doing his job by protecting the entrance, but that his mistake wasn't enforcing the rules. His mistake was the assumption that dignity is determined by wardrobe. I told him that next time he should look at people's faces and treat them with basic human respect, instead of judging them by the price tag on their shoes. He nodded so hard I thought his head might detach from his neck, and I knew that lesson would stick. The walk to the parking lot was surreal. The cool night air felt cleansing after the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. Madison insisted on walking with me to my car, her expensive heels clicking on the pavement, though the sound was less arrogant now. We passed the service entrance where this whole nightmare had begun only a few hours ago. Madison stopped and looked at the rusted sign, the one she had mocked when I arrived. She reached out and touched the metal door, tracing the scratches on the surface. She looked at me and said that she was glad I had come through that door. She said that if I had come through the front entrance in a designer gown, none of this would have happened, and she would still be trapped in a lie, marrying into a family of vipers. She admitted that the destruction of her perfect wedding was the best thing that could have happened to her, because it destroyed the fake life she was building. We stood there for a moment, under the flickering street lamp. Two sisters who had started the night as strangers and were ending it as allies. I unlocked my car, a sensible sedan that gave no hint of my bank balance, and told them to get some sleep because their shift started at 5 a.m. sharp. I drove away, leaving them standing in the empty parking lot, a fallen socialite and a disowned heir, looking smaller but more real than they ever had before. As I merged onto the highway, heading back to my quiet penthouse, my phone buzzed with a notification from my security team. It was a final report on the Ashfords. They had been spotted arguing violently in the hotel lobby before peeling out of the driveway in their leased luxury car. But there was something else in the message, a note from my head of legal. Mrs. Ashford had apparently been screaming about lawsuits and revenge as she fled, threatening to burn my reputation to the ground for what I had done. I smiled, watching the city lights blur past my window. Let them try. I had the truth. I had the evidence. And for the first time in years, I had my sister back. The real work, the rebuilding of Madison, the training of Brett, and the inevitable war with the embarrassed Ashfords, would begin tomorrow. But for tonight, the house had won, and the victory tasted sweeter than any champagne they could have served. The immediate aftermath of the party required a level of logistical coordination that rivaled a military operation. But for the first time that evening, the chaos felt productive rather than destructive. I returned to the kitchen to find Philippe and his team standing in a stunned silence, holding their utensils like weapons of war that had suddenly become useless. They had heard the shouting, seen the mass exodus of guests, and were waiting for the axe to fall on them, assuming that the disaster would somehow result in their termination. I gathered the entire staff, from the head chef to the dishwasher who had laughed about the Ashfords earlier, and gave them the news that would change their night. I told them that not only were they getting the rest of the evening off with full pay, but I was also issuing a significant inconvenience bonus to every single employee who had been forced to endure my sister's tyranny over the last few weeks. The cheer that went up in that stainless steel room was louder than any applause the Ashfords had ever received in their lives. We spent the next hour coordinating with a local homeless shelter to pick up the thousands of dollars worth of gourmet food that had gone untouched. Watching the trays of beef Wellington and lobster being loaded into the shelter's van felt like a cleansing ritual, a way to scrub the stain of excess from the evening. The flowers, those ridiculous, overpriced imports from Ecuador, were sent to a nearby nursing home, where they would actually be appreciated by people who didn't care about the pedigree of a rose. A week later, the real work began, not with a bang, but with the harsh buzz of an alarm clock at 4 a.m. Madison started her first shift in the housekeeping department, a world away from the marketing meetings and brunch dates she was used to. She texted me a picture of herself in the standard issue grey uniform, standing in the locker room with dark circles under her eyes, but a genuine, if terrified, smile on her face. She captioned it with a message saying, this was day one of learning who she really was. I didn't make it easy on her, and, to her credit, she didn't ask for special treatment. The housekeeping manager, a formidable woman named Maria, who took no prisoners, reported that Madison had spent her first 8 hours scrubbing grout with a toothbrush and changing king-size duvets until her arms shook. She came home that night with blistered hands and a backache that she said felt like a punishment from the universe. But she showed up the next day, and the day after that. For the first time in her life, my sister was learning the value of $1 by measuring it in sweat and aching muscles. She later told me that cleaning up after entitled guests who treated her like she was invisible was the most humbling experience of her life, a mirror reflecting exactly how she had treated me and the staff at her engagement party. Brett's transformation was quieter, but no less profound as he settled into his cubicle in the accounting department. It turned out that the man had a brilliant mind for numbers that had been stifled by a lifetime of being told his only job was to look pretty and marry well. He attacked the spreadsheets with a hunger I hadn't expected, uncovering inefficiencies and tracking variances with the precision of a detective. He told me during a lunch break in the employee cafeteria, where he ate every day, refusing to go out to expensive restaurants, that for the first time he felt useful. He and Madison moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a neighbourhood that the Ashfords would have considered a demilitarised zone. They paid their own rent with the money they earned, driving used cars and cooking dinner at home because they couldn't afford takeout. When I visited them a month later, sitting on a second-hand sofa that smelled slightly of lemon cleaner, they looked tired, but happier than I had ever seen them. The desperate, frantic energy of trying to keep up appearances was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of building a life that was actually theirs. They were no longer characters in a play written by their parents. They were real people, flawed and struggling, but real. As for the Ashfords, their downfall was as public and messy as their attempted ascent had been calculated. Mrs. Ashford tried to sue me for defamation of character 2 weeks after the party, filing a lawsuit that claimed I had maliciously doctored the footage and ruined her social standing. It was a desperate Hail Mary from a woman who didn't understand that you cannot defame someone with the truth. My legal team, who had been preparing for this exact scenario, responded with a motion to dismiss that included the raw, unedited footage and the audio files, along with a countersuit for the unpaid party balance and the cost of the investigation. The judge dismissed their case with prejudice in less than 10 minutes, and the legal fees from that failed attempt were the final nail in their financial coffin. They lost the Connecticut estate 2 months later, the bank foreclosing on the property and auctioning off the contents to pay their creditors. The last I heard, they had moved to a rental condo in Florida, where Mrs. Ashford was reportedly trying to charm the local retirees into investing in a revolutionary new business venture. Some people never learn. They just change zip codes and look for new victims who haven't seen the evening news. The security footage from that night took on a life of its own within the culture of my company. It didn't go public to the world. I had no interest in becoming a viral sensation, but it became legendary among my staff across all 17 properties. Someone in the IT department set the footage of Mrs. Ashford stealing from the purse and the subsequent confrontation to the song Gold Digger, and it became an underground hit in the break rooms. Eventually, with Madison's permission, we actually turned it into an official training module for the security and management teams. We called it Quote 18, using it to teach staff how to spot suspicious behaviour, how to handle high-conflict guests, and most importantly, how to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their perceived status. Madison said she didn't mind being the example of what not to do, as long as it served a purpose. She had embraced her redemption arc with a fervour that was almost religious, working her way up from housekeeping to the front desk over the course of the year, earning promotions based on merit rather than bloodline. She became a favourite among the staff, not because she was my sister, but because she was the one who would stay late to cover a shift or help a bellman with a heavy load. 1 year later, almost to the day, Madison and Brett got married. It couldn't have been more different from the engagement disaster if we had tried. There were no crystal chandeliers, no imported flowers, and definitely no purple uplighting. They chose the small garden courtyard of my very first hotel, the one I had renovated with my own hands, for the ceremony. The guest list was small, consisting only of people who actually loved them, our parents who were beaming with a pride that felt genuine this time, a few close friends who had stuck by them through the poverty, and a large contingent of the hotel staff who had adopted them into the fold. Philippe catered the event as a gift, serving simple, rustic food that tasted like home, and the cake was baked by the pastry chef Madison had once made cry. She had apologized to him months ago, and he had responded by creating a lemon cake that was, in his words, quote, 19, quote. There was no talk of mergers or portfolios, no networking or posturing. It was just two people standing under a wooden arch, promising to navigate the messiness of life together, with empty bank accounts but full hearts. The most poignant moment of the day, the one that made me finally break down and cry, was the bridal entrance. Traditionally, the bride enters through the main archway, walking down the centre aisle while everyone turns to stare. But Madison had a different plan, one she had insisted on despite my parents' confusion. When the music started, a simple acoustic guitar melody played by one of the valet drivers, Madison didn't appear at the back of the garden. Instead, the side gate creaked open. It was the service entrance, the path used by the gardeners and the delivery trucks, the path she had mocked me for using a year ago. She walked through it wearing a simple white dress she had bought off the rack, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. She walked past the kitchen staff who were watching from the sidelines, giving them a wink, and made her way to the altar. Later, during the toast, she explained that she chose that entrance because it was where her real journey had begun. She said that the service entrance was the door that stripped away the ego and the lies, the door that forced you to be useful rather than ornamental. Standing there with a glass of champagne, paid for this time, I watched my sister dancing with her husband on the grass. They were laughing, spinning in circles until they were dizzy, completely unconcerned with how they looked or who was watching. I thought about the security guard who was manning the front gate today, a new hire who had been personally trained by me to greet every guest, whether they arrived in a limousine or a beat-up sedan, with the same level of respect. I thought about the Ashfords, miserable in their Florida exile, still chasing a phantom of happiness they would never catch, because they didn't understand that you can't buy it. And I thought about the power of the truth. It had destroyed a party, ruined a reputation, and shattered a family, only to rebuild it into something stronger, something real. I looked down at my phone where a notification popped up from the front desk manager. A minor issue with a reservation. I smiled, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked onto the dance floor. The problem could wait. My sister was happy, my business was thriving, and for the first time in a long time, the service entrance was the only door that mattered.